Welcome to The Spirit of Business, episode number 15. Exploring what business might look like in the future with Matt Murphy and Sarah McCrum.
Hi Sarah.
Hi Matt.
We've just been having a really good chat about what you've been up to since we last spoke, and you said you went and actually looked at some property, and this property was quite an unusual property and really made you have a strong connection with it. And we started to talk about, why you had such a strong connection, and that sort of evolved into a conversation around change and around how we're going to live in the future and how we're going to, think about our businesses and our lives. So it would just be great to have an exploratory chat around that sort of stuff, because I'm not sure that we've actually got any true answers to any of what we're just about to talk about, but it'd just be really good to explore how we could this topic of change and what the future holds for us, given that we're really in this still a significant state of change in the world with the coronavirus.
And so many people are thinking deeply now about the future and how they want to live and how they don't want to live and what they don't want to go back to. And many people are facing change that is more or less imposed on them. They've lost their job or their business, they're losing their business, or their business is having to change very radically, and it's not going to be an easy job to just go back to how things were. I'll just describe a little bit what happened, because it was actually a very powerful and moving experience for me that took me totally by surprise. So we actually went to look at two properties, and the first one was really beautiful view, solid, beautiful house, kind of just felt really strong and stable. I already live in a beautiful house with a beautiful view, and this was even more so. And I had this feeling like, oh yes, I could do what I already do and do it even better. It felt like that property would support what I do. And one of the things I always look for in a property is whether it supports my business, because some properties are kind of draining, I think. They actually drain your business and your money, and some of them are supportive. So that's important for me. And then we went to another place, and it was a totally different experience. We drove in, and it's a property that 50 years ago was a totally degraded cattle property. So with nothing on it except degraded, wasted land, basically. And a couple bought it, and the man died after a little while, and the woman has lived there for 50 years or so. And it's 100 hectares, 250 acres odd, and she has planted there thousands and thousands and thousands of trees, and native Australian trees, everything done absolutely in the right way, apparently. I had somebody who's expert in trees and in the environment and natural land regeneration. And so she'd regenerated this land into, first of all, a haven for wildlife. But it was so much more than that. It was, for me, it felt like a place, it really moved me to be there, because it felt like this kind of nurtured and nurturing place that touches deep into my nature, into my literally like the inner being of me. I felt a connection with nature there that was different from elsewhere. And it has a horrible house and all kinds of things that usually feel important. I like to live in a nice house. I find it much easier to live and work in a nice house. Obviously that can be changed. But it was interesting for me because I was asking myself, if we lived somewhere like this, could I do business from here? What impact would it have on my business? And as I drove into it, this was the beginning of this whole experience. I had this feeling and this sense that the house we just looked at, this beautiful, solid, strong property with a beautiful view, like really a dream place in a way, it felt so artificial. And the life that I live, which is not terribly artificial, but it's felt so artificial. And as we drove into this place, I heard these words in my mind saying, this is the future. This is the future human being. It's like the future human being, we need to become much more aligned with nature and much more aligned with ourselves, who we really are. And that, it was like being spoken into my mind, this message. This is the future human being. So I was driving around this place, totally overawed by the size of it, because it was way bigger than what I had in my mind. But contemplating all the time, what is the future of business? What's the future of humanity? How are we going to live in the future? How do we resolve the issues we have around pollution and climate, and the impact that we have on our planet and and particularly on ourselves? And how do we align that, the challenges we have now around business and the recession that we are in, and people are talking about it being very serious, and so there's going to be a lot of resetting. How do we think about that? And it ties in with conversations we've had recently that are the last podcast we recorded about what do you really, really want in your life and in your business, and how do we create something that actually feels good and true somehow, aligned with myself, allows other people who work with me and my clients to feel aligned with themselves, aligned with life itself, so that we resolve the problems that we're facing as a culture and as a species, and also as individuals. So that's a whole big description of actually a topic that I think is profoundly important at the moment.
You posed some massive questions there when you were talking about, the future. And as soon as you start talking about the future in that particular way, it opens up lots of possibilities, but also probably opens up an amount of overwhelm, because these are things that are hard to solve for and we don't know, and so therefore when you get into that space, it can send you into a place of worry or concern or anxiety and that sort of type thing as well. So we've got to be careful about the responsibility around navigating through that particular thing. But one of the things that you spoke about before we had this call was very much around the way that property looks like to you in Australia, which is where we put property on top of nature, on top of the land, as opposed to being connected with it. Okay, and then also the link with that in terms of business, that there, and that word connection that you spoke about when you were just talking then about how you felt this connection. And you also use the term ecosystem as well, and these are the terms that I'm starting to understand in our lives, in our business, to being connected with something. And you were talking about the property, that you felt a connection with the land in the property, and similarly that you're thinking about doing business on that particular land, okay, in terms of just what you tend to do, but feeling that there could be a great connection between the two. So it's pulling all these things together, and I think that's the strong essence with what we're talking about, is that how do we create a future and a future business life that feels more connected and more grounded. I like the word grounded because that's that connection with the earth, as you're talking about, or the deep connection with something. And it doesn't feel like we're just creating an asset on top of another asset or on top of another thing. So as opposed, but there's that strong connection there. And it's hard to sort of articulate what we're really talking about today in some sense. But I feel that there is this thing that sits there that says that what are we actually doing? What are we actually creating? Why are we creating it?
Why is it important? Is it important, and why is it important to do this? Why is it worth giving your time and your energy and your money to do this thing?
And a lot of the times people will just sort of come back to the simple sense that it provides for my lifestyle and my family. And that on a very basic level makes a huge amount of sense. But once we get beyond that, because we typically do in business, once you start to operate them for a period of time, that's when these questions really start to be posed and pop up. And there's this responsibility that I think that we have as business owners, where we look beyond just the here and now and start to think about, well, what is the deep impact that we're having by doing what we're doing, and what's the responsibility around that, and what's our obligation to build something that's worthwhile, from an ecosystem perspective, from a responsibility of connection with land or connection with people. And it really opens up a lot of questions, especially when you're in the situation that we're in at the moment, that we really are. It's almost like we've hit the pause button. I feel like we hit the pause button in the world, and we're sort of just in this sort of space of just watching and waiting what's going to happen next, the anticipation of what's happening next. And this is the common theme that we've been talking about, in our lives, and with business owners especially, to say, well, what's next? What's going to come next? What do we want to do? Let's create something. But creating it within a framework, and I think that what you're talking about there is the start of thinking about the rules of, and rules are sort of a binary thing, but sort of the essence of the framework in which we say, well, this is what a potentially great life and great business looks like, because it is connected and it has got purpose and meaning, and it is doing something responsibly to create assets and not just put them on top of things like property on top of land without it being connected. That your business is the same, creating assets, not just for the sake of creating assets, but you're doing it because there's a deep connection with whatever you're doing. And I think it's a really important conversation to have.
I want to come back first of all to the thing about the overwhelm. When I was driving around that property, I was in a four-wheel drive being driven by the real estate agent, and I was totally overwhelmed, just overwhelmed by what she had done, what the woman had done. I was overwhelmed by even thinking about the possibility of living there and being responsible for that land. I'm not a farmer. I have lived on land before, but I don't know about trees, So the whole thing was overwhelming. But I think that it's very important for us to embrace at the moment, at any time actually, the feeling of being overwhelmed, and not see that as a bad thing, when it's this simply opening us to different versions of ourselves. One of the things that I've become very aware of because of visiting properties is that each one has an influence on how I'm going to live my future. It changes my destiny, like it changes my future. It's that powerful, the environment that we live in. Now, many people may not have the freedom to change their environment as easily, but the point is that the decisions we make do change our future. And sometimes to feel overwhelmed and simply to stay present with it, not to just go into panic and freak out, but simply to say, right now, I don't know how to handle all of this information, so I'm just going to relax with it and just let it take its time, which is what I needed to do. And very powerful change emerges out of allowing the overwhelm rather than running away from it. I just want to say that because there are going to be many situations in the coming years where many people will feel overwhelmed. A friend of mine just arrived back in America after staying with me for 3 months. 45 minutes before he arrived, curfew was declared in the place where he arrived. That alone could be quite an overwhelming thing to arrive into. You have this, I'm traveling back home, and you arrive in a curfew situation, like what's going on? We need to be able to deal with overwhelm, not like the overwhelm of having too much to do on your to-do list. That's kind of like, okay, learn how to manage that. But this is a time, and the reason why we're talking about this even is this is a time for the deeper questions. Because it might not be that we're on pause. It might be that actually what we're in is a kind of, I described it the other day as like a fishbowl with a magnifying glass. It's like we can actually look into our world at the moment almost at a magnified level and see what's going on. And tiny incremental changes are emerging, tiny shifts are happening, but a tiny shift can turn into a really big shift. And it feels like an important time for listening, really listening, not just waiting, but also listening, because the people who are doing that, they're the people who are also, I think, they're the people who their business will survive and thrive rather than just survive or fail, whether it's listening to clients, listening to the market, listening to the deeper impulses within you of what do you want in your business, bringing all of that together. This is a very good time for doing that.
Like with everything you talk about, there's just so much that I think about and can respond to. The overwhelm bit's a really interesting one, and I was listening to something this morning that spoke about this story where there was a man walking on a beach, and there was tens of thousands of starfish that had been washed up on the beach. And he saw this lady throwing the starfish back, and he said to her, "What's the point? Why are you doing this for? There's like tens of thousands of starfish." And she just looked at the man, and she picked up another starfish and she threw it back in the water, and she said, "It makes a big difference for that one." And so it's, I think that overwhelm is there, but the point to that particular story was around, taking the next step and the next step and the next step in the process, which then can help reduce the overwhelm, because you're actually doing something small that makes you feel like you're progressing towards something. But there's a combination with overwhelm, I believe, where it's sitting in it, being comfortable enough to be uncomfortable to sit in it.
Yeah.
But then also start to do some activity that feels like it's a progressing towards something that you feel is the right way to go. You might not have worked out the whole outcome or story or future direction of it, but you have a sense that that's the direction, and you start to do something, because I think doing something makes you feel less uncomfortable, but not doing something to the point where you're just completely distracting yourself away from feeling that uncomfort of being overwhelmed. So it's a tricky balance, I believe, when I've felt in that situation where I know, and we've had conversations where you posed them before, where it can create overwhelm. You start to think about purpose and direction and future, and what's all the things come up with, and what's the point, and it's really important to, I think, have this balance between holding yourself in that environment, feeling uncomfortable, not freaking out, and actually starting to do something. And I think even what you said then about listening, that's doing something. Listening to the people around you, listening to people in general. And it's funny, when I think about how I built our business, I built our business based on listening to clients and understanding what their needs were, and then creating a product or service to support that. So, which comes back to the old demand and supply sort of type principles of economics, is that you're actually meeting somebody's demand. So you're supplying to a demand, and you're doing that through listening. And I think that that's a great starting point for anything, because if you sit back and you go, well, what is it that's needed right now? And there's been some really, really wonderful examples of that at the moment, where businesses have pivoted because they've sat back and they've actually listened to what's going on. And you were talking before going to that property, you were listening to yourself to say, well, where is it that I'm going to, the best place for me to do business, because that will get a big outcome. And we spoke about this last week about, the decisions that you make can have such a big impact upon what you do in the future, or how you feel in the future about the business. And so it's I think that listening and that reflection and not jumping too quickly and just taking one step slowly at a time and being gentle. I think that's the other point that I feel at the moment, is being gentle in this time, because if we come out like a bull of a gate and think that we've got all the answers and start to head out in the direction again like we did before, I think we've missed an opportunity to really stop, listen and reflect, and I think test and measure too, because I don't think we don't have all the solutions right now, and that the evolution of what we're really going through too, so it's evolving. And so those are the things that are coming in my mind when you speak. So I said, oh yeah, that's exactly what we really need to be doing right now.
I want to pick up on something that we passed through a little earlier, because there are so many threads. It's like we're playing with all these different threads and weaving them together, and sometimes you need to pick up a thread that you left a little while ago when you're weaving. You do some thick colours and then you pick up the other one, and that's this thing about assets and the way we think about business. For me, it's represented in the word asset. I've been surrounded recently by people who talk about assets all the time. And at the beginning of this year, my goal was really to focus on that asset side, to start to develop assets within my business and grow them. And so I took a very different approach to creating a course that could become an asset rather than a course that's just an experience, which is what I did before. But it's interesting because whenever I hear the word asset, it feels so dead to me. And when I was on this property, which is also an asset, but I was looking at it, and there are trees there that you can sell and this, that and the other. But I realized that the real asset is an ecosystem. It's not a dead thing that or even a kind of somewhat alive thing that belongs to me, that is for me to somehow control and get something from. An ecosystem is a connected system that supports me, supports many other species, and supports other people. Everyone who's connected with that ecosystem is somehow supported by it, but they all have different functions in it. And it has such a different feeling for me. If I would see that property as an asset, I would treat it in a completely different way, and I would look at what can I get out of it, what can I take out of it. If I see it as, I could look at how do I grow it first before I take something out of it. If I look at it as an ecosystem, I do look at how does it support me, how does it create an environment in which I can thrive and flourish. But I'm looking at it all the time in a connected way. And now whenever I hear the word asset, I replace it with ecosystem. Maybe somebody will come up with a better word. But
we spoke about this last time about the word appreciate. Okay,
yes.
Because assets appreciate. And so I think that what you're talking about is an extension of that the ecosystem appreciates.
Yes.
Rather than sort of it's a thing. It's something that evolves and continually grows and develops. That's probably a better definition of the word asset. Well, that's fundamentally what it is, but it's just a term, I suppose, at the end of the day.
Yes, but there's such a different energy, and this is one of the ways you can see it. Again, I keep coming back to this property. It had such a powerful effect on me. This woman, I saw the tool that she used to dig the holes to plant the trees. So if you treated a place as an asset, you would probably have machinery to do all of that stuff. And I'm not anti-machinery, but she had this extraordinary tool. I've never seen something like it. It was a little bit like a mattock, but it was like a bowl, which was narrow at one end and wide at the other end, with a handle. And then you use the narrow end to dig the hole, and then the back end, which is the kind of wider end, is like shovels the soil out. It collects soil and shovels it out. And that was outside her front door, and that's what she used to make the holes for the trees, to plant the trees. And there's something that represents something to me about whether you are growing an ecosystem, whether it's on your property, on your farm, or in your business, or in your family, or in your community. Are you growing an ecosystem, or are you growing an asset? It's there's a different spirit to it. And that's what I want to draw attention to, because it actually has a different consequence. An asset fundamentally has a consequence for you, or maybe for your family. An ecosystem has and it may have, there will be consequences to others as well, but it's not part of the intention. An ecosystem has an intention to support many forms of life. And it's a more open approach.
If I reflect about a business and what is a business at the end of the day, and a business is a thing, it's an entity, it has a life of its own. Even in legal principles, a company is actually a natural legal person. So it's a thing. Technically it's a living thing. So getting back to your sort of thought process around ecosystem, based on even that fundamental definition, I see that a business is a living thing, okay? And it is an ecosystem because it's full of people that are all evolving and developing and growing. And so I can see the connection between what you're talking about there in terms of creating an ecosystem and business. We talk about culture in business, and that kind of defines the elements of an ecosystem. And so when I think about what you're talking about there, and the words asset and ecosystem and then business, and you put the whole things together, and I see that maybe the thing that you are thinking about with regards to the word asset and ecosystem is maybe around the responsibility of how we actually are doing business, or how we're actually evolving our organisations. Are we looking at it purely from creation of an asset? Do we look at our people as just assets? Or do we actually look at our businesses and our people as an ecosystem that's evolving and flourishing? And so maybe what your experience is, or what you're thinking about, is more from the perspective of our responsibility of how we look at our businesses and how we look at our lives, not just as assets, but as things that will continually evolve, grow, create, move into different directions. And right now we have probably a great sense of the unknown, and so therefore we're not too sure which way they're going to go and evolve and develop. So I think maybe that's where I think the connection between the word ecosystem and how sort of business has an underlying connection with those things.
And that's important because it determines the way we think. If you think about people as human resources, it's rather like thinking about water as a resource, which is what we tend to do by default in our culture. But water is not a resource, it's a fundamental element of life. It's not something that's there for us to take. It's something that is supplied to us by nature, and we need to be wise in the way that we make use of it and the way we dispose of it in order to support that supply, that continuing supply. And we know that we haven't done that. If you see people as a resource for you to use as the business owner, and we might not think we're doing that, but how easy it is actually to do that, just unconsciously. If you see people as a resource, then it's what can they do for you, or what can they do for your business so that your business wins and somebody else's business doesn't win. When you have an ecosystem thinking, you want other businesses to win as well, because you understand that we grow together and that it doesn't make sense to try to destroy. And then you see yourself as an ecosystem. So instead of saying, well, I'm willing to get really wealthy, or I'm willing to create a really successful business so that I can have a good exit and have a good retirement, and I'm willing to sacrifice myself for that. I'm willing to sacrifice my health or my well-being, my happiness, or the connection with my family because my business is so important. That's thinking of yourself also as a resource or an asset that you don't value terribly much because you have this other asset that you value more. Whereas when you see it all as an ecosystem, you realize that it's important to support life across the whole system, and it expands your sense of self. Actually, it expands the responsibility you're willing to take. It's a much kinder way of thinking, so it actually makes you feel like a nicer person. It feels good to look at the world in that way, rather than in a more it feels a little bit old to me, that more competitive way. And it's supportive to, it's also supportive to people who are not the winners. And that's really important. If we live in a world of winners and losers, there's very, very few people who can win. But if we start to create an ecosystem, you can have small plants and big plants, and they can all thrive. You can have ants and worms and microbes and things thriving in huge, great trees, and they live in symbiosis with each other. That works. They don't all have to be big. A worm doesn't have to be the size of a tree.
The word that comes up then is the word connection for me. So when you're talking there, you're talking about a connected system, okay, and rather than a competitive system. Competitive to me feels like it's pushing against each other or pushing against things, whereas a connected environment is something that works in cohesion, and an ecosystem works in cohesion, because that's the whole principle of it, that there's things that go on in it to continually flourish life and move it forward. So and I think that if I reflect back on stresses of business, one of the greatest stresses of business is competition, because you're competitively trying to evolve your business faster or stronger than somebody else, or you're trying to attract and retain talent better than anyone else. So there's just constantly this underlying competitive nature that goes on, and I think that creates a reasonable amount of stress, because it is competition by its nature is about winning or losing. And if you're able to not have to worry about that, I think it would calm our lives as well. And so that's also another element of this that makes sense, that if you're creating a connected ecosystem environment for business where everybody is flourishing and enjoying the elements and the fruits of a ecosystem, it'd be a far better and calmer and easier business life that we would have.
Yes, it feels so much healthier. It doesn't mean that everybody will succeed. Like in any environment, in any ecosystem, there's still some plants thrive and some don't, and you can observe that competitive element in it. But what I feel is this: what thinking this way does is it encourages us to find our uniqueness. What is it that my business is really special at? What's our contribution, and what kind of contribution do we want to grow, rather than how do we beat the others and become the best? It's like what can we be really, really good at, and allow other people to be really, really good at other things. And then, because even at school, I was top in most things, and that was very praised. It was just like the way to be successful at school was to be top in just about everything. And the super successful people were even successful in sport and academics. I wasn't a particularly sporty person, so I didn't have that double thing. It was more academic. But really, it's a strange environment. And I know schooling has changed quite a lot since then. But if you think about it, if you think about how can we create an environment where people who are not so strong in certain dominant characteristics or capabilities, but they're strong, they can find where their strength is and really express that. I saw a beautiful audition actually on, I was watching a little bit of YouTube last night of a guy who was a dustbin man in America, and he came on to sing, and he didn't know any of the singing terms. He didn't know. They said, "Can you show us what your voice can do, what your range is?" He said, "I don't know what range is." They said, "What pitch can you sing in?" "I don't know what pitch is." They tried playing the piano with him. He said, "Oh, I've never done this before," but he had a fantastic voice, and he loves to sing from the back of the dustbin truck. And there was something very endearing in that, in somebody who finds this beautiful quality in himself. Yes, I'm sure with some training it can be even better, and maybe he'll get that because he had the courage to show up in this audition. But the real point about it is that each of us finding that little thing that makes me feel special, that makes me feel good about my life, and not needing to be like the guy who's running the business next door or the guy who's the competition over there. I don't need to be like him because I'm actually not like him anyway. And I never was going to be, and this business was never going to be like that business. And it feels healthier.
It does. But the thing that you sort of mentioned then is that it comes back to also another sort of term about inside of an ecosystem, there's always going to be people that things that can, animals or plants that are competing with each other, and the law of the jungle and all that sort of type thing that exists. But then listening to you further, you spoke about the fact that okay, but you can change and you can find the thing that you are going to be probably better at, or enjoy more, or do more, that's not always in competition with the same.
Yeah, I mean, there's no point. There's no point saying, "Oh my goodness, I can see there are 1,000 lions in this environment, so I'm going to just walk in there and be a zebra. I'm just waiting to be killed." But we don't do that. I mean, actually, I think a lot of people do that. They say, "Oh, I want to go into business." And in fact, there's just probably 1 or 2 lions there already that are going to take them out straight away. It's like, no, go and find something more suitable. And I think this is really important because one of the trends that I suspect will be very strong will be an absolute massive expansion in self-employed people.
Yeah.
So taking those first steps to business, and some of them may go on to grow bigger businesses and some of them will stay self-employed. We've already seen that a lot with contractors and outsourcing and freelancing, and I rely heavily on people who have that freedom to work how they want. This, I can only see that growing and growing so rapidly. And if all of them are trying to do exactly what they did in their corporate job, that's not going to feel good or look good. So again, we come back to really, really asking the questions about what do you want? What do you want in your business beyond just the question, I've got to have a business so that I can survive financially? Because we've seen time and time again that when people do business just to survive financially, that's just what they do. They survive financially, or maybe not. There has to be something bigger than that that helps you to go through the challenges that we all have in life. We have challenges in business, we have challenges in life, and we need to be able to keep going through those. So we need something more than financial survival to draw us forward.
To fundamentally enjoy the journey, and really going back to the point about the property, you wanted to create and find an environment that you could enjoy the journey of your business on. That's kind of the core to it too.
Yes, and that would support my business. And what this one made me do is think, this will support my business in a completely different way. I recognized a few weeks ago that the principles of what I see as the business of the future is based in nature. And it is based in the way ecosystems work. Long time I've been teaching everything really is based on natural principles, but I recognized it much more clearly that business itself, nature provides beautiful examples that can show us how to do business. And then going to that property helped me to see that somewhere like that, I can actually really immerse myself in those principles and feed all that beautiful work that this woman has done. Allow that now to nurture me. I do the same work with human beings that she does with the land. She regenerates land. I regenerate human beings, essentially. That's really what I do. I help them to to come into alignment with their nature, their natural ecosystem, feel true to themselves, to feel relaxed and good in life, and to thrive, just like she was doing on that land. So to use the gift that she's created to grow both me and my business based on those very fundamental principles of how do we take something that has got degraded, as I think we have at some level as human beings, eating too much. You know, we eat toxic food, we breathe toxic air, we've just degraded ourselves emotionally, mentally, in many different ways. We exhaust ourselves, we work too hard, or just a bit out of touch with ourselves. How do we take that somewhat degraded being, whether it's a piece of land or it's a human being or it's a culture, and bring it more alive, regenerate that fundamental life force so that we feel good, we feel like ourselves again. So it's exploring this principle of nature, of connection, of ecosystems, of life at all levels, for myself, for my business, for the place where I live, and that will have an impact into our culture and beyond.
And really, these conversations are great because what they do is they spark thought process at a time where we're really planning for the future. So regardless of really, whether we've got an answer or not an answer about any of this stuff, this is all about creative thinking of developing an answer and looking at all aspects of it and all aspects of your life, rather than just sort of continually going down the same path that we've done before in that linear sort of fashion that we have to keep building assets and do more and more and more. Whereas this is saying, well, hang on a minute, what is it that I really want and what direction I want to go into, and how can I have a greater responsibility to, many facets, whether that's sort of the land, whether that's earth, whether that's, business, or whether that's contribution to people or to economies, whatever it actually is. I think it's just important that people start to think a bit more beyond, the way that we thought before. And this evolution is going to ultimately, and the good part about it is these questions are posed for the sense of how do I have a better life? And really fundamentally that's what we're always trying to do, is how do we have a fundamentally better life? And so posing these questions of ourselves now will allow us to make incremental steps to getting ultimately towards where we want to get to.
There's a guy called Kevin Kelly who founded a magazine called Wired, which is a online technology magazine, very, very significant online technology magazine. He wrote a book called The Inevitable, or The Inevitables, I'm not sure. And he describes 10 inevitable technological trends. And the thing that he says right at the beginning of the book and right at the end of the book is the number one question that human beings are going to need to ask themselves for the next 30 years, if not the next 100 years, is who am I and what does it mean to be human? So we are asking these questions before the technology is pushing us. But the way technology is going, it will push us to answer these questions anyway. And I feel that we've been given a gift, in a way, to have this slowing down in the world, to start to ask the most important questions of our life, because none of us are going to be able to avoid them. And there is one other thing. You talked about responsibility. We talked about overwhelm, but we talked about taking responsibility to face and not distract ourselves from that overwhelm. Children, young people, are growing up in an environment where the way adults behave around them, as always, has a profound influence. I've heard of children and very young people experiencing depression, experiencing hopelessness around the future, saying, what's the point of being here if the world is like this? We must take responsibility for how we, as the older generations than those children and young people, respond to what's happening. We must. We must stand, we must find our strength. We must find... I don't think it's about answers. I feel it's more about curiosity, it's exploration. We said at the beginning of this we would explore this topic today. This is where we need to be more and more of the time these days, exploring, curious, probing into the future and creating it as we go along. I feel that we must do that for our younger generations as well as for ourselves.
And you spoke about children, and the thing about children is that they explore and evolve. They don't sit back and think about, well, the consequences of the future and, you know, mapping out their future plan. They fundamentally just test and play, enjoy, evolve. And so it's a good analogy to talk about thinking about our lives more in a childlike way of doing that.
Yeah. And many of us would really enjoy that.
Absolutely. Well, it's been another amazing conversation, Sarah, and there's been lots in it to just ponder. I think that's probably the thing that I'll do post this conversation, is just continually ponder what it is to continually evolve.
Me too. Thank you very much, Matt.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to The Spirit of Business with Matt Murphy and Sarah McCrum. We'll be back next week with another episode. You'll find the show notes with links and other useful information on our website, spiritofbusiness.live. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends.